Welcome, everybody. This is Tim Richter with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and welcome you to our Canadian Shelter Transformation Network webinar with Iain De Jong of OrgCode. I'm going to pass it over to our co-chair, Sandra Clarkson, to kick things off. Sandra, over to you.
Thanks, Tim. I'm Sandra Clarkson, Executive Director of the Calgary Drop-In Center, and welcome all of you to joining us on our second of our four-part shelter transformation webinar series. Information on the series has been emailed, but it's also available on the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network website under transformshelter.ca/webinars. Recording of this webinar and all of the others will be posted there as well, so you can feel free to go back and share with your teams, revisit what was said during the webinars. In terms of next steps, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness Conference, we are going to be doing a learning planning meeting from 2 to 5 p.m. on November 6th in Edmonton at the Edmonton Convention Center. That meeting will be focused on networking, peer learning, and planning for the year ahead for the network. And we're asking everyone that can make it to register so that we can plan accordingly for the number. And you can either register when you register for the conference, or if you are not attending the conference, there's also an opportunity for you to register via an Eventbrite link that we will circulate after this call. If you have registered for the conference but have not yet registered for the session, you can go back into your registration confirmation email, and there is a link there that you can reopen your registration and select the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network session. Just as another reminder, we're hoping to get as many people completing the housing-focused shelter self-assessment tool, particularly members that are working in shelters, and work with your shelter leadership to complete that survey. It is also available on the website under Transform Shelter /resources. And I believe that should be on your screen now. And so why are we asking people to complete this? I think it's what we're trying to accomplish by having you complete that self-assessment is we want to have a sense of where our shelter members are today in becoming housing focused. We want to give shelters a sense of where they sit in the transformation process and some insight on what you might need to do next to help improve. Help us gain a better understanding of where members might need additional support so we can plan our resources, training, topics for webinars, etc. moving forward to make sure that we're being really effective with our time together. And lastly, to benchmark shelter transformation as a whole and see over time what progress is being made in this movement. And it is, of course, all results will remain anonymous, and we will be sharing aggregate data or results, and those will be shared at the learning and planning meeting in November. The deadline to take that self-assessment is coming up right away. It's on October 4th. So please send your completed self-assessments to tim@caeh.ca. And that wraps up my welcome and forecasting for the rest of this webinar. And I'd like to welcome Iain De Jong, who is going to be leading us through the next portion of the meeting. And then there'll be a final 15 minutes of Q&A moderated by Tim. So I hope you stick with us through the entire webinar. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting information that Iain has to share with us. So thank you, Iain. I will pass it over to you.
All right, Iain,
thanks, Sandra.
I'll stop sharing, let you share your screen, and away we go.
All right, is my screen up?
Hang on.
Yep. Well, your name is?
Should be a title slide.
Okay. 2 seconds. Can you see it, Sandra?
You know what, I cannot.
Stay tuned. We'll get this figured out. Ian, have you had the, did you hit the share?
There we go.
There we are.
There it is. I see it.
Apologies for the technical difficulties in getting started. And I'd like to say a great hello to everybody from coast to coast to coast who might be joining us today. And the theme of our conversation today is setting expectations instead of enforcing rules. And this comes from a perspective of how we go about influencing positive behavior within shelter for the intention of improving housing outcomes. And so it's not just about behavior, it's about trying to ensure that some of the rules, even expectations that we might be setting within shelters, aren't interfering with a trajectory towards housing for the guests that you are serving. So I want to start with a series of critical questions. And if you're like many shelter providers, some of these questions might be a little unsettling to you. I want to be clear that this isn't intended as an affront to any particular provider. These are the sort of critical questions that help us improve our practice as it relates to rules, expectations, and moving towards housing outcomes. So the first critical question that I'd like to ask is, how can a shelter promote safety without creating unnecessary barriers to services and housing? And this is really the rub for many shelter providers, that they've done a really good job of thinking through all the ways in which they can or should keep their guests safe. Along those lines, there's often a lens of how they can or should keep staff and volunteers safe within the environment, and sometimes think about rules or expectations related to safety that impact the broader community. Things like good neighbor policies or committees that are set up with a series of partners to try to help them work through the process of ensuring that shelters are as safe as they can possibly be. But in the process of creating those barriers, what we often see are impacts of establishing rules or expectations that impede the ability of people, especially very vulnerable people, in accessing services or accessing housing. The second critical question, if someone is denied service, where do they go? As communities are working more and more on coordinated access, on prioritization, and throughput into housing, this question perhaps takes on greater relevance than it might have historically. To that end, what we start to think through is, if someone is barred or service restricted from your shelter, it isn't even so much as where do they necessarily go in community per se, but how do we keep connection to that individual or family so that we can keep the progress towards housing going for them? The third critical question, if someone is barred from service, what's the purpose of it? Was it intended to be punitive? Was it intended to be rehabilitative? How long should it be for? In our work with a number of different organizations and communities, what we have found is they haven't answered the question of why they're denying service, other than to say that there was a specific issue within the shelter that needed to be attended to relative to safety. But in terms of how long it should be for, even within specific communities that may have more than one shelter serving the same population, there's very little consistency. So what might end up being a 1-day service suspension in one community ends up being a 3-day or a 7-day service suspension in another. And if we don't have consistency for those people who are actually going about using our services with the hope of achieving housing, how long are we disconnecting them from the pathway to housing? One of the things that we found, and we'll get into this a little bit more as the webinar goes on, is that perhaps the greatest tool that shelters actually have is a 10 or 30-minute time away as opposed to barring people or service restricting people overnight. And the fourth critical question, if there is more than one shelter in your community that serves the same population, is there consistency in what is expected of guests? If we don't have consistency, we might create an environment of service shopping. And while not intended, it can be very disruptive to the pathway of helping people achieve housing. So which rules are the right rules? The age-old question. In some organizations, what you'll find is 4.5, 5 pages of rules. In other organizations, you'll find that rules are much more selective in their application in terms of who actually, or what rules and number of rules are actually in place and for what purpose. So the role of rules. If you were to go through your rules right now, why do you have the rules? Or perhaps more precisely, why do you have each rule? If you go through that process meticulously, you should come to an understanding that some rules are needed and some rules actually aren't needed. And so that leads to a broader critical question of, are you providing social service or are you actually exercising social control? Is this really about trying to create a pathway to housing? Or is this about the power dynamics, or perhaps more accurately, the chasm that exists in the power dynamic between those who provide the service and those who receive the service? Is the rule really about you, or is it about ensuring good quality service and housing outcomes for the people you serve? As we start to think about retooling the rules, one of the steps that we ask most organizations to go through is a process of identifying which are the Marvin Rules. You might be wondering, what's a Marvin Rule? Well, it's a term of affection actually come up with by the National Alliance on Homelessness in the United States of defining those rules that were created because one specific person did one specific thing at one specific point in time, and then he created a rule that you then start enforcing with everybody. Just about every organization we worked with has one or more Marvin Rule. What are examples of Marvin Rules? Well, they can include, for example, in one community, they had an issue with people going into the bathroom, taking wads of toilet paper, getting them wet, throwing them up, and having them stick to the ceiling. That shelter, almost 15 years ago, put in place a rule that if you wanted access to toilet paper, you had to have staff. Another example of a Marvin Rule, once upon a time, a person that we'll call Marvin lit a trash can on fire. And from that point in, the shelter enforced a rule that everybody had to turn in their lighters and request permission to get their lighter back when they went out for a cigarette. I could go on, but the real point that I'm trying to make is, if you have rules that are about a specific outlying incident, as opposed to a series of repeated behaviors that actually need to be adjusted because of issues of safety, then you probably have some Marvin Rules. And Marvin Rules can probably be taken out of your rule delivery package because all they really do is present a barrier to housing. A few things that have no place in shelters and should not have rules or expectations attached. Again, as we start to think through the pathway to housing and we start thinking about what makes a shelter housing focused, some of the things that repeatedly come up in communities that actually interfere with the ability to achieve a housing focus objective are things like requirement of provincial ID or any ID, or in family shelters, proof of marriage, or requirements that people participate in religious activities, or that people have some sort of proof of motivation or readiness. Other examples include things like behavior contracts with people, or requirements to be sober or participate in substance use treatment in-house. Now, to that end, when we think about the likes of requirements to be sober or participate in substance use treatment, if we have shelters that all demand sobriety, we're probably not going to be reaching those people that we really need to be reaching, who are most vulnerable and have the greatest number of barriers to access to housing. If we use things like proof of motivation or readiness, well, we really don't have any good way of measuring that. So it becomes very subjective. But there are organizations that have rules that say, if you're not proving that you're motivated, if you're not proving that you're ready, you can't stay here. Behavior contracts are an interesting one. because I think the intention behind them in a lot of instances is that we are having a transparent conversation with the individual or family that says that they need to do X, Y, and Z as a condition of stay. But there's also a fair amount of knowledge related to how adults respond to such things. And while you might get changed behavior in the short term, you're very unlikely to get long-term changes that you might actually be seeking relative to changed behavior. Whether you call them expectations or rules, you also want to make sure that you haven't created an environment that becomes exclusive of certain people or types of people in your shelter service delivery system. So examples of that could be a community that has rules that say male-led single-parent heads of household can't be served within a family shelter. If we look at the experience of some other countries in this regard, what we started to see is the development of fair and equal access rules that essentially say we can't use discriminatory behavior. Now, does this mean that every single facility is designed to be in a position where they can accept and support male-led single-parent households? At this point, probably not. But if there's no place for male-led single-parent head of household to be served by way of rule, then we've taken a segment of the homeless population and said that they can't be served. Similarly, there's examples of rules that we've encountered that are quite common that say teenage males as part of a family unit can't be served. Now, this has a debilitating impact on the family unit as a whole and on the trajectory of that male's pathway out of homelessness. If our rules or expectations are actually changing the composition of the family unit, then we have to ask ourselves whether or not we'll be achieving the housing outcomes for the family as a whole if our very rules are the things that are disintegrating the family unit from its ability to stay intact for the purpose of achieving housing. The third one that comes up quite frequently is the ability to serve and support intergenerational families, what that looks like, how we go about doing that. And if we can't actually serve the entire intergenerational family, they actually have to be disconnected by way of rule, then how do we bring that family back together if they wanted to be housed as a common unit? Whether you call them expectations or rules, your community should be able to accommodate non-English or non-French speaking persons depending on where you're at in the country. And sometimes there are shelters that have expectations that people can communicate their needs in one of the two official languages, and their inability to be served in either of them presents a barrier towards housing being achieved. Next up, the people who identify as transgender, gender fluid, or any gender nonconforming identities. We should be in a position where by rule and by right, we can accept and serve people based upon the gender identity that they present with. In doing so, we can ensure that that population group does have a pathway to housing that doesn't require them to be carved off or set aside or treated as if there's something wrong with their gender identity. And I'd also point out that we need to make sure that our rules are not taking the likes of sex offenders and saying that they can't have housing outcomes by denying them service. I'm not so naive to think that every single shelter is configured or located in a location that would make it possible to serve sex offenders, especially given that many sex offenders have conditions of their release that doesn't allow them to be in proximity to certain other populations. Nonetheless, if your community as a whole can't accommodate sex offenders within your homeless service delivery system, then you'll end up with a whole lot of sex offenders that are unhoused. The very dramatic downside of that is that there is research that suggests that the likelihood of reoffending goes down when people have stable housing. And finally, our ability to make sure that by way of right or by rule, that we're not eliminating the ability to serve large families. And that doesn't mean it's easy, but if we're in a position where we're excluding large families from being served within our homeless service delivery system, it means we're also excluding large families from being housed as an entire family unit. So the role of rules or expectations fundamentally come down to promoting safety. How do we go about addressing behavior without trying to control or change people? How can we create an environment where rules or expectations are accepting of people as opposed to excluding people. So if you were to go through a process of reviewing your current rules or expectation, for every single rule or expectation that you have, try to answer these 4 questions. First up, how does this activity or service get people into or hinder people from getting access to housing? Do you have any rules or expectations that actually interfere with that process or make the process more difficult? If so, how would you go about adjusting it so that you can still promote safety but not deny people throughput to housing? Ask yourself about the rule or expectation. How does this keep people safe? And to that end, you might be asking which people, under which conditions, and what do you mean by safe? We often make assumptions that we're on the same page when it comes to things like safety. And I'm not saying that we want to work or serve people in environments that are inherently unsafe, but we also must accept and appreciate that we are working with, in many instances, higher risk, more vulnerable populations, that if we applied the same mentality towards safety that wasn't inclusive or all-encompassing of the needs of people with particularly problematic behaviors, we're going to be excluding a lot of people from a pathway to housing. Is this rule about controlling or changing behavior? Well, ultimately, we might see the shelter as an environment to heal or fix people. But that might be misguided if we're actually thinking about shelters as a process as opposed to a destination. The goal of the shelter isn't to heal or fix a person, is to ensure a pathway to housing as quickly as possible within the context of the resources that are available in your community. If we start about controlling or changing behavior, you might even think that you're promoting positive behavior, but ultimately, how would that change in behavior be sustained when the person moves beyond the walls of your shelter? In other words, is this a passing change that is about making your job easier within shelter that has no bearing upon how the person is going to be successful in housing over the long term? And do you have any rules that hinder people from getting housed quickly? The sort of thing that you might see there are rules or expectations, for example, that people participate in, let's say, a 6-week life skills course, or an 8-week budgeting course, or a 12-week parenting course. It's not to say that those things are bad ideas or that they get in the way of people getting housed, but they certainly get in the way of people getting housed quickly. If people think that me staying in shelter longer is somehow going to make me more ready for housing, that's perhaps a misguided approach to how we view the role of shelters within the work of ending homelessness. And when you do this review, might we encourage you to not do it on your own? To have peer organizations and partner organizations look at your particular rules and provide commentary back to you, being open to what other professionals and allied partners have to say about your specific rules. I'd also encourage you to engage with current and past guests on their perceptions and interests of the rules. Now, to that end, let's also be clear. Sometimes guests would love you to have more rules rather than less, but that's often as a result of the specific need of the person providing the rule. And if you provided them the lens, particularly relative to these 4 questions, whether or not it hindered people from getting access to housing, whether it impacted safety, whether it was about controlling or changing behavior, or whether it hindered people from getting housed quickly, if you provide them the framework or the lens by which to look at your rules, you'll probably get the sort of feedback that you'll find most beneficial to move towards changes in your rules to be more housing focused. So where do these overly punitive rules or expectations seem to stem from? Well, in our research, we've been able to boil it down to several themes that come up on a fairly regular basis. One is Marvin. I won't belabor Marvin anymore, but as I was saying, just about every single organization has had at least one Marvin in their past and at least one rule that came about as a result of Marvin. Sometimes it's because of staff lacking appropriate training in trauma-informed care and de-escalation. And to that end, some staff that don't necessarily understand, and some organizations that don't necessarily understand that some of the rules and expectations have created, or in some instances, more accurately, the enforcement of those rules and expectations is actually more trauma-inducing than it is trauma-informed. And when staff aren't equipped with the skills to de-escalate, it's not altogether that baffling to see that some shelter staff start to see themselves more in a role of policing behavior rather than supporting and serving people. And you'll know this when you hear certain things from your fellow staff members. If you have anybody that you're working with who likes to tell you that they caught someone exhibiting a certain behavior, engaging in a certain way, rather than having conversation about how they supported someone in better meeting your expectations in the future, it tells you something about their orientation of how they see the power dynamics between staff and guest. Which leads to the third point. Some punitive rules come from those who relish power and fail to see the power dynamics in the relationship between worker and guest. If we establish rules just to meet our needs without meeting the needs of our guests, then it's more about us and less about the people we serve. Sometimes punitive rules come because of antiquated models of compliance. So things like sobriety is a condition for a shelter stay, and if you don't conform with that rule, you're out. That again is more about behavior change than supporting people towards a trajectory towards housing. There's no doubt that some organizations are actually afraid of the people that they serve. You'll see this manifest in all sorts of different ways. But because today's conversation is around rules and expectations, as opposed to, let's say, for example, having 3-tiered entrances with plexiglass, bulletproof plexiglass with small holes to talk to people, it makes you wonder if you're in the right industry. And I think some of the overly punitive rules or expectations seem to stem from a contentment to blame guests for behavior management issues rather than seeing the role the staff play in those issues as well. So very much a blaming behavior, as opposed to asking, have we done anything as the service provider that might have stimulated or result in that behavior being manifest. And now we transition into a conversation about how do we go about retooling those rules? And we're going to further follow that up with a conversation about how we can start to reframe our rules into expectations. So if you were to do analysis of all the reasons why people have been kicked out, I'll bet that there are certain reasons that rise to the forefront. And this is where you should be able to do a bit of an analysis to determine which of the behaviors that resulted in people being denied services were really about safety issues, and which behaviors are behavior management issue that was handled by asking the client to leave. In other words, there was no process by which we assisted the individual or family in better meeting that rule or expectation. We thought that the enforcement of the rule or expectation was going to be in and of itself a reason for behavior change. So if we think about the themes that we want to capture as we go about retooling the rules, you might start or find it helpful to start with these 3 major categories. Are we restricting service in matters of violence, including sexual violence, excessive damage to property, and theft? It's not to say that there aren't major themes, but those seem to be the 3 major themes that have specific elements related to safety that are easily communicated with program participants relative to the expectations of what we're trying to achieve in shelter. And then if we go about making it work, I've divided this into 2 different categories. The role of rules and expectations for people receiving services versus the role of rules and expectations for people providing services. Let's look at it from the end user's perspective first, where safety probably means minimizing loss of control over their lives, as opposed to the provider of services, where safety most often means minimizing loss of control over the environment. There's inherently a potential conflict in different perspectives of safety. Because to the person receiving services, safety is about maximizing choice. It's about authentic relationships, It's about seeing what the limits are. It's about understanding self. It's about experiences without judgment. It's about receiving consistent information and getting that information ahead of time. It's being free from behaviors that force me to do things that I may not want to do, or coercing me to do things I want to do, or threatening or punishing me or harming me for doing or not doing certain things. And safety means that I can own and express feelings without fear. That's come about from a number of focus groups with people who stay within shelters and their understanding with safety. What you'll see is that the opinions of a lot of frontline staff differ in the interpretation of safety. Whereas the person receiving services wants to maximize choice, well, if you're a staff person within shelter, you probably want to maximize routine and predictability. Safety probably means if you're a staff person, assigning staff based upon availability and setting limits as opposed to exploring limits. It's a lot easier if you're a staff person to define problems and come up with diagnosis. That doesn't mean from a medical perspective, but diagnosing what the problem actually is. Rather than defining experience without judgment, there's lots of staff that judge experiences to determine competence and appropriateness of services. Whereas an individual receiving services probably feels more safe if they have a lot of information, especially in advance. If you're a person providing service, well, if you're run off your feet at all hours of the day and all elements of your shift, you probably provide information as time allows, which may be very different than the information needs of the individual who's staying within your shelter. We have seen that some staff use threatening force to de-escalate situation. Force doesn't necessarily mean physical force. Threatening force can also mean removing someone from the environment. You do what I say or else. And the or else is usually some sort of restricted access or no access to service. And this demand of compliance is what allows staff to feel safe, that they have the power and control to institute that with guests. And whereas safety for the person receiving service often means owning and expressing feelings without fear, what do we want as staff in many instances? Well, an environment that actually doesn't have strong emotions being expressed. We see them as disruptive, harmful, getting in the way of what we're actually trying to achieve. So let's shift the focus and start to think about the distinction between expectations and rules. A rule, by definition, means that there's authority exercised over another person. Expectation, by definition, means that someone can achieve what is explained to them. How does this actually work? And is it just semantics? Well, it's not just semantics. Let me try to put in this another way. Rules are enforced. Expectations are socialized. Think about the intake process within your shelter. There's probably some element of the intake process where you want that individual or family who has come into your environment to be in a position where they understand what the collective behavior is that's expected within shelter. If we go the rules part, that intake process is usually a series of, and I'm paraphrasing here, thou shalt. Thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. If thou does decide to do either of these, here's the consequence. You'll be asked to leave for X period of time, or if you do things repeatedly, it results in a behavior contract or a note and file, or a meeting with the team leader, or the manager, or the director, or the executive director, but it's consequentialist in nature. When we say that expectations are socialized, is it a way that we can actually lay out for people what those common behaviors are that is expected, but without the heavy hand? Especially if I have a small number of expectations at the time of intake, I could explore with that individual or family, which of these expectations will be most difficult for you to meet, and how can we go about supporting you in doing so? Which is very different from the consequentialist approach that said, and if you break any of these rules, here's what happens. To put this into a bit of a storytelling framing, one of the organizations that we worked with had just over 4 pages of rules. They tried to get through those rules with every single household that they served at time of intake, both individuals and families. What they came to realize is that in their analysis of the rules and their enforcement of rules, that the further along the list that the rule was located, the more likely it was that there was what they would call violations of the rules. In other words, there seemed to be a period of time in the intake process that people just shut down and stopped absorbing information. That was really helpful to learn. The second thing that was pretty apparent is that there was inconsistency in terms of how those rules were applied by various staff. On one shift, it was interpreted one way. On another shift, it was interpreted another way. Sometimes those had to do with the leadership on the shifts. Sometimes it had to do with the length of time in the industry of the people working on those shifts. Sometimes it came down to differences in age, race, ethnicity, whether or not people had experienced homelessness themselves and had lived experience who had then come on to be staff. But there was loads of variations in the interpretation and enforcement of rules. But as this organization worked towards expectations, what they found is that they generated conversations with their guests. And that generation of conversations with guests led to generation of conversations amongst staff. And those staff started to interpret and see things in similar ways. So in moving from rules to expectations, here's an example. This comes from that same organization that I said was trying to make the move from rules to expectations. What does that mean? Well, they had those 4 pages of rules that they had, and what they came to realize is that they could translate 4 pages of rules into 8 expectations. How? Well, by looking at the specific themes of what was actually behind each of the rules. Let me give you some examples. They said, our shelter cultivates desirable shelter resident behaviors by expecting program participants to do the following. And they laid out 8 expectations. I also understand, as an aside, that we seem to be having technical issues that while I am flipping through my slides, you seem to be on the title slide still. I will make sure that even though I've been speaking to specific slides, that the slides in their entirety also find their way to the Shelter Transformation Network website, and that you can put all of this insight into context as you move through the slides on your own. And my apologies for technical difficulties that we might be having. So they said, our shelter cultivates desirable shelter resident behaviors by expecting program participants to do the following. Demonstrate responsibility for themselves, their actions, and their housing plan. Number 2, store all prescribed and or over-the-counter medication in the designated area. 3, abstain from behavior that is disruptive and unacceptable to others. Examples include verbal, physical, or sexual assault, or harassment, threats, and or violent behavior, nudity, possessing weapons, drug dealing, etc. 4, keep bed and common areas clean. 5, not to damage the building or property. Excessive damage to the building may result in termination of the program. 6, to smoke only in designated areas. 7, to have an active voice in helping us improve. And 8, accept responsibility for your own stuff, and you may not buy, trade, and or sell stuff with others within the shelter. 8 expectations, which can be filled in on half a slide, or half a sheet of paper in the size of a postcard. And in doing that, getting it to 8 expectations, they found that there was much more fruitful conversation with people at program entry. Things like understanding whether or not they understood what was meant by abstain from behavior that's disruptive and unacceptable to others. That could be turned into a question. What sort of things would you find disruptive and unacceptable? What sort of things would you want to make sure others don't do that's disruptive or unacceptable? Or a conversation around keeping bed and common areas clean. What do you think the standard should be for cleanliness? How do you think we should go about ensuring that we don't have fire hazards or infestation of pests? And the list kind of goes on in terms of the exploratory nature of each one of these expectations. Now, as a background to this, it's not to say that you can't have other things posted in other parts of the facility. For example, if you had dietary services where you offered a meal or several meals throughout the day, it's entirely okay to post notice that, for example, breakfast is only served between 7 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. You can have those sorts of expectations, or even if you want to call them rules, posted in different parts of the shelter environment that does not require you to lay out every single one of those rules within an intake, but also what would be the consequences if someone showed up at 6 o'clock looking for breakfast? Well, they're not going to get it. There doesn't have to be if you show up for breakfast at 6 o'clock and we're not serving breakfast, you're going to be asked to exit the building. Will the move from rules to expectations result in chaos? And this is probably one of the questions that we get quite frequently. And to be quite honest, in the early stages, the movement from rules to expectations can be disruptive. And it can be disruptive because staff and guests, especially those who are accustomed to a rules-based environment, try to figure out where the lines are drawn. What's the limits? What is going to be enforced? What's not going to be enforced? How is it going to be enforced? What are the consequences? What about our existing service restriction or barring policies? How is that going to change as a result of doing this? Who's going to review them? There's a lot of work in that disruption. One of the organizations we work with found that they had hundreds of service restrictions on the records, and that they actually had several that were especially considered to be problematic insofar as they were really vulnerable people who were given lifetime bans for behaviors that probably didn't warrant such a strong reaction upon second thought. So what happens over time? Over time, staff spend more time supporting people and spend less time policing people. Think of all the effort, minutes or hours in any given shift, that can be carved off just with dealing with the consequences and the implementation of punishment for people who broke the rules. Imagine that same time, and quite honestly, usually less time, is invested in turning those into constructive conversations that keep the focus on this. How is our ability to serve and support you going to result in better housing outcomes for you? So that we're not talking about the behavior in isolation of what the end goal of what the shelter is trying to achieve. That is, as a pathway to housing. Over time, petty issues do not explode into full-blown conflict. And what that really means is we probably spend too much time in the weeds dealing with stuff that we really don't need to deal with. Too much time trying to get people to change who they are so that we can give them what they need, rather than us accepting people for who they are and giving them the best possible service to achieving housing outcome based upon who they are. And over time, expectations will become the new norm. For some organizations, that's 3 or 4 months. For others, it's 6 to 12 months. And larger organizations probably find themselves towards the latter end as staff continue to work through all the intricacies of really being in a position where they support people in meeting expectations rather than enforcing rules. The usual pushback: I feel unsafe at work. The usual pushback: there are some people that you just know aren't going to change. The usual pushback if they don't change their behavior here, how are they going to be successful in housing? And what we really need to do is flip the script on those, I'd say, firmly held and frequently held feelings. This is not about making staff feel unsafe. On the contrary, we're actually promoting safety by having less conflict and more constructive dialogue. This isn't about getting people to change who they are so they're going to be successful in housing. This is helping people work with their behavior so that they are going to be more successful in housing. And this isn't about putting punishment in place. It's not about learning lessons. This is about us actually cultivating an environment of support so that people can be the best version of themselves in their housing moving forward. And in light of the technical difficulties, why don't I stop my narrative there, and we'll let Tim and or Sandra jump on and chime in and perhaps let me know about specific questions that might have come up in the context of doing this speech, because it didn't turn out to be a presentation, and we can go from there.
Thanks, Iain. Apologies for the technical difficulties. I'm not exactly sure what's going on or why that happened, but like you said, we'll make sure everybody gets copies of the slides. So for everybody that's on the webinar has any questions, please feel free to put them in the question and answer pane. I think and I believe the background noise that a few folks have commented on, maybe just at Iain's end as he's on, just stepped out of a meeting to do the webinar. So, oh, look at that! Suddenly, suddenly the slide changed. Okay. Anyway, there's a question here for what are Iain? It says, what are your recommendations for service system managers tasked with developing and implementing service restriction protocols or standards?
Well, I mean, as a general rule, I think if we take that out to kind of a broader audience, without framing what it is we're trying to achieve, the usual result is that we end up with hundreds of rules, as opposed to a handful to a dozen expectations. So really framing it, if you're the service manager who's trying to work on service restrictions and trying to help people understand what's in and out of scope in terms of the service restrictions, for every single service restriction that's being proposed, asking, how do we think this is going to help people move closer to housing? Will this interfere with people's housing? How will this promote safety? And I'll also go back to, is this part of the Marvin Rules? Is this something that we're creating because one incident with one person as opposed to being pretty standard behavior with a number of individuals? So that would be the kind of framing or lens that I would use. And the kind of general themes that I go back to is personal safety, safety to property, issues of theft. And there's usually 2 or 3 other really pertinent themes that communities want to go into. But when we start, again, creating rules that are about controlling behavior as opposed to supporting people in the housing process, we're misguided. The other thing that I'd say a service manager can do, if they have a number of willing service providers who are willing to provide some of the service restriction data, is to analyze what the reasons are and what the length of those service restrictions tend to be. And if they tend to be more of longer in duration rather than shorter in duration, we probably have an entire system fix that we need to be putting in place to make sure that we're not punishing people. And so that's kind of the general orientation that I would take relative to that.
Okay. Now, do you find a difference in how these expectations are approached or applied or developed, depending on the different kind of shelter? So if you have a shelter for single men, or a family shelter, or a youth shelter, do you find there's differences in application or differences in approach that are worth noting?
I think there's some nuances relative to the specific populations. So for example, if I was operating a family shelter, I might have an expectation that you will care for your children at all times and not leave them in the care of others. I'm, not wordsmithing that, but the sentiment is probably what I want to convey. Relative to a lot of youth shelters, there might be an expectation that youth are working on their housing in addition to participation in school or the workforce, or attempting to re-engage with both of those. With staff assistance, we're happy to help you out. You know, those sorts of things. Again, sentiment, don't get caught up in the wordiness or the wordsmithiness of what I just said. But those sorts of things are in place, and socializing them, right? I think that, you know, expectations are socialized, not just with the end user of service, where we want to make sure that they understand, but socializing them throughout our entire organization to say, hey, you know, if we're a youth serving organization, so these expectations fit with what it is we're trying to achieve in helping youth achieve housing. If we're a family serving organization, do these expectations fit with our objective of trying to make sure families have the ability to move into housing? So the lens always comes back to, regardless of population, does it help or hinder a pathway to housing?
Mm-hmm. What are the most common barriers to making this shift, would you say?
I'd say a really big one is institutional legacy. We've always done it this way, therefore we will always do it this way. That certainly comes up quite a bit. That's number one. Number two is a feeling, so not evidence, but a feeling that they've established calm and control within the shelter as a result of having rules enforced in a certain way over a certain period of time. And the rub of that is that part of that could be true. However, you might have relegated a whole bunch of people who might have been better served in shelter for a pathway to housing to being unsheltered, to being served nowhere. In which case, you haven't solved the issue of homelessness and trajectories to housing. You've created an environment of, you know, out of my purview, therefore out of mind. And one of the things that we're just starting to realize, we're part of a large research piece with the policy lab at UCLA, is that the needs of unsheltered homeless individuals are very different than the needs of sheltered individuals, but that many of those people who are unsheltered had at least some time in their history a time in shelter. And so either shelter has rejected them or they have rejected shelter. And in interviews with a number of those people who are unsheltered, which is a separate piece of research, one of the things that they often point to is the policies and rules of the shelter that became a barrier for them to receive good service and for them to receive good outcomes relative to their housing. So, you know, sometimes it's an illusion that we've created calm, when really it's calm because we're not serving the people who need us the most. We're serving those people that we selected to serve based upon compliance of behavior.
Awesome. That's super helpful. So I'm not seeing any other questions coming through the question panel at the moment. I'll just open up, see if Sandra or Matthew would like to just say a couple of words. I've got, you should be seeing on your screen, the emphasis being on should be, our upcoming webinars. We'll be placing a recording of this webinar and Iain's slides up here at transformshelter.ca/webinars. But I'll just open up, see if Matthew or Sandra have anything they'd like to add.
This is Sandra here. I think want to thank Iain for the presentation today, and I know that speaking from the experience here at the Calgary Drop-In Center, really shifting from rules to expectations, you know, we've certainly experienced challenges, and I think that, you know, the idea of that institutional practice has been tricky, and it's been, I don't think we've landed for the fine balance between where we need to be in terms of, in particular, addressing incidents of violence. So we're continuing to work on that. We are making a point of gathering feedback and input from the frontline staff on a regular basis so that we can really refine it and get it to where it needs to be. And, you know, we, as an organization, Iain had mentioned during his presentation about I'm not sure if it was us you're referring to, Iain, with the agency with, you know, hundreds of people with really long-term bars or life bars that didn't really make sense based on what the incident was. You know, when we looked into it, we had over 4,000 active bars in place, and so have done a tremendous amount of work reviewing those, because recognizing that if people are barred, where else are they going to receive service? So it has been a great exercise in terms of flipping that perspective around. We continue to keep that feedback loop going with the frontline staff. We want to make sure that not only are we providing ready access to service, but also ensuring that the staff are feeling safe in the environment. So appreciate the input today, and that's what I would like to share, just from, you know, how we've been dealing with it in practice, and we're continuing to refine it.
Terrific. Thank you, Sandra. Okay, gang. Well, I think we will wrap it up there. As I mentioned, we'll have the Iain's slides and a recording of this webinar on the website probably later today, if not first thing tomorrow. And do please send us your self-assessments so we can get planning for our learning and planning session coming up in November. Thank you all very much. That ends the webinar. We will see you all on October 8th for Maintaining a Housing Focus, with first-time shelter guest presented again by Iain. Thank you all, and have a great day.